My father died on a Tuesday morning in April 2019, 3 days after his 87th birthday. His name was Robert Chen, and for as long as I could remember, he'd been the quietest man I'd ever known. He worked as a postal carrier for 30 years, came home every evening at exactly 5:15, ate dinner while reading the newspaper, and went to bed by 9. On weekends, he tended his garden and fixed things around the house. He never raised his voice, never talked about his feelings, never discussed his past. When I was young, I'd asked him about Korea. All I knew was that he'd served there in the early 1950s during the war. My mother had mentioned it once or twice. Your father was in Korea before we met, but she didn't know many details either. What did you do in the war, Dad? I'd asked when I was maybe 10 years old. I fixed trucks, he said without looking up from his newspaper. Just a mechanic. Nothing special. Did you ever see combat? No. I was in the rear. Now go finish your homework. That was it. The only conversation we ever had about his service. Whenever Korea came up on the news or in history class, he'd leave the room. When Memorial Day came around, he never attended ceremonies or wore his uniform. The only evidence he'd ever been a soldier was a single black and white photograph in a drawer. A young man in army fatigues standing next to a jeep, squinting into the sun. Just a mechanic, he'd said. For 50 years I believed him. My father died of a heart attack in his sleep. Quick, peaceful, exactly the way he would have wanted. We arranged for cremation. His wishes stated clearly in his will. But the funeral home called me 2 days after we'd submitted the paperwork. Mr. Chen, we need to discuss something before we proceed with cremation, the director said, his voice careful. During the preliminary examination, our medical examiner discovered anomalies. What kind of anomalies? Metal fragments. Throughout your father's body. Dozens of them. Given the amount and location of the shrapnel, we're required to notify the medical examiner's office. They'll need to perform an autopsy to rule out any unusual circumstances. Shrapnel. The word didn't make sense. My father was a mechanic. He wasn't in combat. Sir, I can only tell you what we found. The medical examiner will provide a full report. The autopsy took 3 days. When I received the report, I sat in my car in the medical examiner's parking lot and read it twice, then a third time, unable to process what I was seeing. Autopsy report. Robert Chen, age 87. External examination reveals healed scarring consistent with multiple combat-related injuries. Internal examination reveals extensive presence of metallic foreign bodies throughout subject's torso, back, and extremities. Metal fragments catalogued. 47 pieces of shrapnel embedded in back, chest, and shoulders, 12 fragments in left leg, consistent with fragmentation grenade injury, 8 fragments in right arm and shoulder, 3 fragments lodged near spine, too dangerous to remove surgically. Multiple healed fractures. Left femur, 3 ribs, right clavicle scar tissue consistent with gunshot wound, lower right abdomen scar tissue consistent with burn injuries. Approximately 15% of back surface. Assessment. Injuries consistent with repeated exposure to combat conditions. The distribution and variety of wounds suggests sustained combat experience over an extended period. Estimated minimum 25 to 30 separate combat engagements. I stopped reading. Stared at the numbers. 47 pieces of shrapnel. 12 more. Broken bones. Gunshot wound. Burns. My father, the quiet postal carrier who fixed trucks in Korea, had been in at least 30 battles. 30 battles he'd never mentioned. 30 times he'd nearly died. And he'd spent 50 years calling himself just a mechanic. I started with the photograph. The one picture he'd kept from Korea, young Robert Chen standing beside a jeep. I'd looked at it 100 times growing up and saw exactly what he'd wanted me to see. A mechanic posing with a vehicle. But now I looked closer. At the patch on his shoulder. At the rifle leaning against the jeep. At something I'd never noticed before. In the background, barely visible, was a sign that read 1st Cavalry Division, 7th Cavalry Regiment. The 7th Cavalry. I Googled it. The 7th Cavalry Regiment was one of the most heavily engaged units in the Korean War. They fought at the Pusan perimeter, at Pyongyang, at the Yalu River. They were in some of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. My father wasn't in the rear fixing trucks. He was in the 7th Cavalry, in the middle of the worst fighting of the war. I requested his military records from the National Archives. It took 6 weeks for them to arrive. A thick envelope full of documents I should have requested years ago. Service record: Corporal Robert Chen, U.S. Army. Unit: 7th Cavalry Regiment, 1st Cavalry Division. Service dates: June 1950 to September 1953. 11B Infantry campaigns: Pusan Perimeter, Inchon Landing, Liberation of Seoul, Chosin Reservoir, Spring Offensive 1951, Punchbowl, Heartbreak Ridge. Wards: Silver Star 2, Bronze Star with Valor 3, Purple Heart 5. Combat Infantryman Badge, Presidential Unit Citation, Republic of Korea Presidential Unit Citation. I stopped breathing. 2 Silver Stars. The third highest military decoration for valor. 3 Bronze Stars with Valor. 5 Purple Hearts. 5 times wounded in combat. And he'd told me he was a mechanic who never saw action. My mother had died 6 years earlier. After the funeral, I'd helped my father sort through her belongings. He'd been methodical about it, keeping very little, donating most of it. But now I remembered. He'd kept one box. A single cardboard box he'd carried to his bedroom and put in the back of his closet. Just some old papers, he'd said when I asked. Nothing important. I drove to his house, my house now I supposed, and found the box exactly where he'd left it. Inside were letters. Hundreds of them. Letters he'd written to his mother during the war but never sent. A journal of 3 years in Korea, written in neat, precise handwriting that deteriorated as the dates progressed. June 15, 1950, shipped out today. Everyone's saying this will be over in a few weeks. I hope they're right. I hope I'm home by Christmas. Tell Dad I'll write when I can. September 3, 1950, Pusan Perimeter. We've been fighting for 3 days straight. Lost half our platoon. I don't know how I'm still alive. Johnson was right next to me when the mortar hit. I can't stop seeing it. Can't stop hearing him call for his mother. I'm so tired, Mom. So tired. December 1950, Chosin Reservoir. It's 20 below zero. We're surrounded. Chinese everywhere. Williams froze to death last night. Just sat down during the march and didn't get back up. We had to leave him. I'll never forget his face. May 1951, Spring Offensive. Shrapnel in my back from yesterday's attack. Medic pulled out what he could. Says some pieces are too deep, too close to my spine. Says I'll carry them forever. I guess that's how it works. You carry the war with you. In your back. In your head. Forever. August 1951, Heartbreak Ridge. Rivera died in my arms this morning. Told me to tell his wife he loved her. I wrote down her address. When I get home, if I get home, I'll write to her. I'll tell her he was brave. I won't tell her he cried for her at the end. Some things should stay buried. The entries went on. Page after page of combat, casualties, horror. Names of men who died. Descriptions of battles that sounded like hell on earth. Moments of terror and exhaustion and grief so profound I could barely read them. And then, abruptly, they stopped. September 1953. The war is over. We're going home. I thought I'd feel relief, but I feel nothing. Just like I left the real me back there in the mountains with all the others who didn't make it. I've decided something. When I get home, I'm not going to talk about this. Not to anyone. What would I say? How could I explain what it was like? They wouldn't understand. They shouldn't have to understand. I'm going to get a simple job. Live a quiet life. Pretend I was just a mechanic who fixed trucks and never saw combat. Maybe if I pretend long enough I can forget. Maybe if I never talk about it, it won't follow me home. Maybe. That was the last entry. I spent 2 weeks reading everything. The letters. His service record. Unit histories of the 7th Cavalry during Korea. after-action reports from the battles he'd fought in. I learned that my father had landed at Inchon during MacArthur's famous amphibious assault. That he'd fought in temperatures 40 below zero during the Chosin Reservoir campaign. That he'd earned his first Silver Star for rescuing 3 wounded soldiers under heavy fire. That his second Silver Star came during Heartbreak Ridge, where he'd held a position alone for 4 hours after his entire squad was killed. I learned that the 7th Cavalry lost over 50% of its strength during the war. That my father survived when most of his friends didn't. And I learned something else. He'd carried it all in silence for 66 years. I organized a memorial service. A real one, not the quiet cremation he'd wanted. I invited veterans organizations, Korean War historians, members of the 7th Cavalry Association. I displayed his medals, the ones I'd found in a box in his attic, still in their original cases, never worn. I displayed his uniform. I displayed the letters he'd never sent. And I told his story. My father told me he was just a mechanic, I said to the assembled crowd of 50 people, mostly veterans who'd never met him. He said he fixed trucks in the rear and never saw combat. For my entire life I believed him. I thought my dad was just a quiet postal carrier who'd done his time and came home. I held up the autopsy report. 3 days ago I learned the truth. My father carried 47 pieces of shrapnel in his body. He had fragments from at least 30 battles embedded in his back, his chest, his legs. He had broken bones that never healed properly. He had burns and gunshot wounds and scars he'd hidden under long sleeves for 66 years. My voice broke. He was a hero. He saved lives. He earned 2 Silver Stars, 3 Bronze Stars, 5 Purple Hearts. He survived some of the worst fighting of the Korean War. And he never told anyone. He went to work every day, delivered mail, came home, and pretended he was normal. Pretended the war hadn't happened. Pretended he didn't wake up every night with nightmares about Chosin or Heartbreak Ridge or the faces of the men who died beside him. I looked at the veterans in the audience. Some were crying. Some were nodding. All of them understood. He's gone now. And I'll never get to ask him why. Why he hid it. Why he minimized his service. Why he chose silence over recognition. An elderly Korean War veteran in the front row stood up. I can tell you why, he said quietly. Because that's what we did. We came home from that war and nobody cared. Nobody wanted to hear about it. Korea was the forgotten war before we even left. So we forgot it too. Or we tried to. We got jobs, raised families, and buried the war so deep we hoped it would stay buried. He gestured to his chest. I've got shrapnel too. 3 pieces in my left lung. Never told my wife. Never told my kids. What was the point? They couldn't understand. So we carried it. In our bodies. In our heads. In silence. He looked at the photograph of my father. Your dad wasn't hiding from you. He was protecting you. From the truth of what war really is. From the knowledge of what he'd seen, what he'd done, what he'd survived. He wanted you to have a father who was whole, even if he never felt whole himself. After the memorial, I received dozens of letters from Korean War veterans and their families. One woman wrote, "My father also said he was a mechanic. When he died, we found medals he'd never mentioned. Your story helped me understand why." A veteran wrote, "I served with your father. I was in his unit at Heartbreak Ridge. He saved my life. I tried to contact him after the war, but he never responded to my letters. Tell him I never forgot. Tell him he was the bravest man I ever knew." Another, "My dad died with shrapnel still in his body too. 40 pieces. He called himself just a grunt who did his job. Reading about your father helped me understand my own. I donated my father's medals to the Korean War Memorial Museum. They're displayed now with his photograph, his service record, and one of his letters. The plaque reads, Corporal Robert Chen, 7th Cavalry Regiment. 2 Silver Stars. 3 Bronze Stars with Valor. 5 Purple Hearts. He told his family he was just a mechanic. His body told a different story. My name is Michael Chin. For 45 years, my father told me he was a mechanic in Korea. He said he fixed trucks. Said he never saw combat. Said it was nothing special. Then he died, and an autopsy revealed 47 pieces of shrapnel embedded in his body. Evidence of 30 battles he'd never mentioned. Wounds from a war he'd spent 66 years pretending he didn't fight. I learned that he earned 2 silver stars for valor. That he saved lives under fire. That he survived when most of his friends didn't. That he carried the war in his body, literally, for the rest of his life. And I learned why he lied. Because a generation of men came home from Korea and found that nobody wanted to hear about it. So they buried it. They got jobs. They raised families. They lived quiet lives. And they carried the war in silence, in their bones, in the shrapnel they couldn't remove. My father was one of them. He died before I could tell him that I understood. That I was proud. That he didn't have to minimize his service. That being a hero didn't make him any less human, any less my father. But I'm telling him now. Dad, you weren't just a mechanic. You were one of the bravest men who ever lived. And I wish you'd told me. I wish you'd let me know you. But I understand why you didn't. And I love you anyway. For the forgotten warriors of the forgotten war. The men and women who served in Korea and came home to silence. You weren't forgotten. Your service mattered. Your sacrifice mattered. And your stories, even the ones you never told, matter too. Rest easy, Dad. You carried it long enough. Now we'll carry it for you.